He's accused of links to the sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. He also failed government security checks. Yet Peter Mandelson was appointed UK ambassador to the US. Now the Prime Minister is under pressure to resign. But will he? And how will the fallout impact the UK Labour Party? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Tom McRae. The Mandelson scandal has resurfaced in the UK and Prime Minister Keir Starmer is in the line of fire again. This time it's because he appointed Peter Mandelson as ambassador to the United States, even though he failed the government's security clearance. Starmer says he did not know, but the opposition isn't convinced. As the fallout deepens, calls are growing for him to step down. Mandelson's links to the late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein have cast a shadow over Starmer's government. So, will the Prime Minister survive the crisis? We'll talk to our guests in just a moment, but first, this report from Imogen Kimber.
Pressure is mounting on UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. It's the second time he's come under fire for his appointment of Peter Mandelson as ambassador to the United States. Mandelson was sacked in September 2025 for his links to sex offender and paedophile Jeffrey Epstein. It's now emerged that he failed the government's vetting process but was still appointed to the senior diplomatic position. Starmer says he didn't know.
Not only was I not told, no minister was told. And I'm absolutely furious about that. What I intend to do is to go to Parliament on Monday to set out all the relevant facts in true transparency, so Parliament has the full picture.
The leader of the opposition says that's not good enough.
Despite it being known that his appointment would pose a risk to national security, somehow he was appointed anyway. Either the Prime Minister is lying, or he is so incompetent that he is unfit to run the country.
A senior advisor to the Prime Minister says the Foreign Office knew Mandelson had failed security clearance. But this letter states Mandelson had it.
The fact that that process did not require officials to tell the Foreign Secretary or the Prime Minister that they ignored the advice of security and vetting officials is totally unacceptable.
One senior Foreign Office official has already been fired. Most Labour Party members of Parliament have rallied behind their leader, with a few exceptions. To force a leadership contest, 20% of Labour MPs need to back a challenger. That's 81 politicians.
Mr. Speaker, let me
Although if Starmer was found to have knowingly misled Parliament, he would have broken the ministerial code and would be expected to resign. UK local elections are just weeks away, and opinion polls suggest they could be punishing for Labour. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in all our guests now. All of them are joining us from London today. Denis MacShane is a former UK Foreign Office Minister of State and Labour MP. Jennifer Nadel is the co-founder of the cross-party think tank Compassion in Politics. And Giles Kenningham is the founder of the consultancy Trafalgar Strategy and a former communications director for the UK Conservative Party. Thanks so much for joining us here on Inside Story. We do appreciate your time today. Denis, if I can begin with you. You've served as a Foreign Office Minister. You know how these appointments work from the inside. How serious is the damage to Keir Starmer right now?
It's serious in the sense that many people believe, myself included, it was a mistake ever to consider Peter Mandelson, who has many political talents, to be ambassador to the United States. He was brought into the cabinet by Tony Blair, but Tony had to fire him because he took a huge loan from another very, very rich MP, but didn't declare it, which is a parliamentary sin, if you like. And then Gordon Brown, when he became Prime Minister, found he couldn't live without Peter, so he brought him back from being a European Commissioner. And blow me down, Peter comes back and then starts asking for residence permits for two Indian arms traders called the Hinduja brothers, who the Indian government wanted to put on trial. And when that came out in the open, Gordon Brown had to fire him. None of us can understand why Keir Starmer, maybe he thinks it's third time lucky, thought Peter would be of use. The idea that any individual in Britain gets better access to Donald Trump. Surely the one thing we've learned in the last 6 weeks is that Donald Trump lives in his own world and just doesn't have any relationships with anybody in another country that are normal and decent. So a lot of it's concocted. It's rather sad this weekend when we should be focusing, I think, on the Gulf, on opening the Strait of Hormuz, on helping our friends in the Gulf states, on Putin continuing to rearm and press and threaten other countries in Europe, just like the Iranians are. We've got a kind of Yahoo game of the Tories, Nigel Farage and Kemi Badenoch accusing Starmer of all the sins under the earth. I mean, the basic problem is it was a misjudgment by a Prime Minister who does have a bit of a record on political misjudgments.
OK, so a misjudgment, Giles. You've worked at the top of Conservative Party communications before. Starmer says he knew nothing about the failed vetting. I mean, is that credible, do you think, to take Keir Starmer at his word right now?
I mean, he must be the least curious Prime Minister in history. This is a guy who campaigned on a ticket of having been a lawyer, director of public prosecution, someone who said that he had a forensic approach to policy making, to politics, yet we've just seen one disaster after another, where it's always someone else's fault. You know, Mr. Rules doesn't want to live by the rules. And I think at the moment, you know, Starmer, it is going to be a slow political death. He's on borrowed time. His greatest weapon is uncertainty. I don't think he will be removed right now in the middle of local elections. But I think after that, there will be a growing chorus of calls for him to set out a timetable for his departure.
OK, so from what you're saying, you think he could survive until after May the 7th, when we have those local elections in the UK. Jennifer, if we can take a step back and explain to our international audience what the developed vetting process actually is, what it's designed to do and how it works.
So the vetting process is carried out by a separate organisation within government, and it seeks to establish whether or not someone is safe, whether they are safe with the most sensitive information, which of course an ambassador to the United States would be privy to. It's very intense at this level. It's very personal. It involves extensive interviews and an investigation of connections and any possible suspicions about him. However, the advice that is given is not binding, so it can be overridden. What I think is really troubling about this is the idea that no one more senior than the senior civil servant to whom the vetting clearance was given was privy to this. And I think we have to look at the Prime Minister's words. He's a lawyer and he's chosen them very carefully. No minister was told about the failure of the vetting. And no minister may have been told, but they may have known. There's also another factor, which is that the Independent newspaper, which is one of the UK's national newspapers, ran a front page story saying that the vetting had been failed and spoke to the press team at number 10 Downing Street and told them. So the idea that no one more senior than the press team or the civil servant in the Foreign Office would know about this is slightly hard to believe. That said, I think we have to look at the context in which Mandelson was appointed. And I agree with Denis MacShane that he is a far from ideal candidate. But at the moment that he was appointed, we had a long trusted ambassador to the United States who was leaving, and we didn't know the full scale of what Trump would be doing, but we did know that he was going to be a very difficult president to deal with. And the reason why Mandelson kept being reappointed despite previous bad conduct was he was a master of the dark arts. He's highly political, highly connected, and it may well be that Starmer just said, I've got to bite the bullet, swallow back all my concerns about him and get him appointed. And that was the instruction that was given to the civil service. Right,
Denis, I can see you're chomping at the bits to jump in here. Can you just? I know that from what you've said before, you're no great fan of Mandelson. Do we know why at this point in time why he actually failed that security process?
No, I don't. I remember as a minister being appointed and incredibly excited when every morning in my box, a red box in my office, there was a plain paper folder with material that the MI6, our spooks, were sending in for my area of responsibility, which was the Balkans, which at the time was very, very sensitive, a lot of very dodgy business going on. And I was thrilled. Then I started reading all this information. I thought, wait a minute, I read that in The Economist 2 weeks ago. Hang on, I read that in Le Monde 2 days ago. The idea that there's some super state secrets that swizz around and shouldn't be given to X or Y, I think is wrong. Peter, no, I'm a fan of Peter in that, together with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, he brought the Labour Party back from the dead, the living dead, and gave us a long period of government, which I can tell you, given the wreckage we've had in the last 10 years of now negative growth and declining GDP, many people, even business people, right-wingers, would be quite happy to get back to. But we are where we are. Mr. Starmer was a very successful lawyer. Then in his 50s, he decided to retire and take a retirement job as a politician, but he never did a training course in politics, and that's one of the difficulties. A bit like President Macron in France, great banker, not a very good politician.
Right. For our international audience, I just want to bring them up to date with those that might not really know the ins and outs and the history of Peter Mandelson. Before his fall from grace, he was a prominent UK Labour politician. He was an advisor to Tony Blair and is credited with helping him win the 1997 and 2001 national elections. And during his career, Mandelson held senior cabinet roles, including Secretary of State for Trade and for Northern Ireland. He was also an MP for the industrial port town of Hartlepool. Now, between 2004 and 2008, Mandelson served as the European Commissioner for Trade, and he is no stranger to controversy, as we heard. In 1998, he resigned over an undeclared loan, and in 2001, he was accused of using his position to help associates acquire passports, and he stepped down, but was later cleared over that. Giles, if I can bring you back in here, I mean, that's all before we get to his ties with Epstein. Is this man going to be the one that brings down Keir Starmer, do you think?
Yeah, I think ultimately he will be. He's already claimed 3 scalps in the process. Clearly, it's been a catalogue of events which have led to Starmer being in this position where he is literally on a political life support machine. But yes, ultimately, I do think it's going to be his poor handling. I mean, apparently, Keir Starmer said, he didn't even speak to Peter Mandelson before he appointed him. According to him, really didn't have anything to do with it. It was done by his subordinates, by his delegates. But, ultimately, advisors advise and politicians decide, and he needs to be held accountable for this. Clearly, the political calculation that was made was that appointing such a controversial and polarising figure like Peter Mandelson was a price worth paying. I think that price may well be Keir Starmer's job as Prime Minister.
Jennifer, the Conservative leader has said that how could Starmer not have asked basic questions about what went wrong with the appointment? She went on to say the Prime Minister is either lying or he is so incompetent that he is unfit to run the country. Either way, do you see his position as untenable?
I think this substantially weakens his position, and I do think it goes to the heart of a really corrosive issue in politics generally, and particularly in this case in the United Kingdom, which is about integrity, which is about the role of honesty. Is it political expedience first? Is it denial first and then accountability second? Or can we actually shift to a system where honesty and integrity are of the highest accord? And it's interesting because this issue comes just before a law is due to be passed in the UK Parliament, which would make misleading the public a criminal offence. It's part of the measures that were introduced as part of the Hillsborough law, which came after the terrible tragedy for Liverpool football supporters who died, and there was a cover-up. And now it's actually, in the future, if this bill passes, it will be a crime to mislead the public. But of course, Starmer isn't the first person, and Giles will know only too well, because the Prime Minister he worked for, Boris Johnson, misled Parliament repeatedly, and that was over a matter of whether or not parties were held. And I think we've got to keep this in perspective. This is not an issue of personal gain or personal misconduct. This is misjudgment. Unfortunately, it is misjudgment that feeds the corrosive belief in the public that politicians can't be trusted. I don't think it'll be the final nail, but the May elections are when many people expect Starmer's position to really become untenable if Labour does do very badly at those elections. So I think it doesn't help his position, but ultimately, I don't think he will resign over this.
Okay.
The civil servant responsible has resigned, and I think the government is hoping that that scalp will be enough for now.
Well, misjudgments, as we know, can end political careers, Denis. One of the reporters that interviewed Keir Starmer after this all came out said, why do you always end up sounding like a passenger in the government rather than the driver? 2 years in, and it doesn't sound like you have a grip on your party. Is that the heart of the problem for Keir Starmer?
Partly, yes, indeed. As I said, a very skilled lawyer, but not a practicing politician. The great politicians like Margaret Thatcher or Tony Blair, they do Oxford, maybe they become a lawyer, and then they do politics. They do it for 10 years, 20 years, and they get at it. I love the idea of a law, and all good luck to the idea of a law that would make it a crime to mislead the public. I can give you the names of a few newspaper editors who will be in prison very fast if that law is finally adopted and implemented. But yes, I think that people were always a bit concerned that Sir Keir didn't have just the political arts. You can call them dark arts, you can call them cunning, call them what you wanted. Well, Churchill had them, Roosevelt had them, the great leaders we've had have had to have them, especially in a democracy. You don't need them in a dictatorship. And now, as was said, it's not just local elections on May the 7th, it's the parliaments of Scotland and Wales. About, by my calculation, 4,500 Labour candidates will be facing the electors on May the 7th. If they wake up on May the 8th, and a lot of them are out of work, the MPs, the Labour MPs they work with, will look at the Prime Minister and say, hey, we don't want to lose our jobs in a couple of years' time. Have you thought of perhaps doing something else?
Giles, you've managed political communications at the highest level in the UK. Starmer describes the situation as unforgivable. He's clearly absolutely furious in his words. How do you think he should be handling the next 48 to 72 hours in the lead up to going to Parliament on Monday?
Well, look, as ever, transparency is the only way in these situations, and being fully accountable. Starmer has said he's going to go to Parliament, and what he really needs to do is set out a very detailed timeline of who knew what when, and publish any relevant documents. Solly Robbins, the former permanent secretary in the Foreign Office, who has carried the can, who's had to resign or who's been fired over this whole debacle, will be giving evidence to a parliamentary select committee on Tuesday, and that could be a real bombshell moment, could once again cause huge problems for the leadership, because from all the briefings you're reading in the UK press, he's not going to go quietly. He feels like he's been made a scapegoat and he's going to fight back. So the idea that this story is going to go away anytime soon, I think, is not the case. It's got many days to run.
OK, Jennifer, as we heard, the top civil servant at the Foreign Office, Ollie Robbins, is basically taking the fall here. Is he a scapegoat? Because we heard that the former Foreign Office chief, Sir Simon MacDonald, say that this is the biggest crisis for the diplomatic service in decades. Is that a fair assessment of how things stand right now?
That is how it's being talked about, but I think there have been worse crises. Ollie, the civil servant that was fired, his allies are coming out and defending him. But actually, I think it's good that we have accountability. I think the public needs to see that if a mistake is made, there is someone who carries the can for it. The question is, should the senior civil servant have carried the can for it, or should it have been his political master?
Denis, who do you think should have taken the fall for this?
Well, in the end, the buck stops, as President Truman said, on his desk, on the Prime Minister's desk. But I often ask myself, the IMF has just given Britain the news that its economy in the last 10 years since Brexit has been the worst performing in the G7. We've lost 8% of GDP. Now, all the decisions on government side taken by very senior civil servants in the Treasury, in Number 10, as well as the politicians. We've had 5 Tory prime ministers since Brexit, because each one was progressively more useless than his or her predecessor. Who actually accepts responsibility for the lamentable state of British defence, of British economy, of British policing, of British education? There is a crisis in Britain that people are not properly discussing, but the leaders of the opposition, quite rightly, just say, oh, it's all the fault of Keir Starmer, liar, liar, pants on fire, you're a liar, you're awful, you're dreadful, off you go. But I'm afraid if it was that easy, Britain could just fire a prime minister and start becoming a successful country again. It isn't that easy.
I guess carrying on from that point, Giles, how does the media in Britain play into all of this? I mean, the British media loves this scandal, as we know, loves the personalities, is not particularly interested in getting too in-depth in policy talk. Does a scandal, does a crisis like this just feed the British media?
Well, I think politicians who blame the media is a bit like blaming the weather. I mean, politicians ultimately have to be held to account in these situations. Yes, I would say we probably have one of the most vibrant press sort of media corps in the world. Yes, it's probably the most hostile, but ultimately, I think that's a good thing. Look, actually, this first story that really the people who kicked this story off about Mandelson's links to Epstein were the papers. And for a long time, Starmer was kind of saying, nothing to see here, move along. Well, I don't know. I haven't spoken to him about this. Once again, I was saying, not very curious. It was actually the press, by keeping those questions going, who actually held the government's feet to the fire. Are the press perfect? No, they're not. But I'd much rather have a vibrant press, which is asking these difficult questions. And yeah, of course, this is a huge story for them, and it's one that's going to run and run. But I think quite rightly, the government's feet are being held to the fire. You know, as Denis says, we can look back at history, but ultimately, Keir Starmer's been in power for 2 years. And what does he stand for? We know what he's against, but we don't know what he's for. There is no political agenda. There's no real story to tell, which is why things are unraveling so quick for him.
Jennifer, Denis touched on this a little earlier. In the greater scheme of things, is this crisis with Mandelson, is it even really a big deal? I mean, we've obviously got the conflict that is ongoing in the Middle East, the wider economic fallout from what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz, fuel shortages, the cost of living crisis. Is this really a time for people to be focused on a political internal crisis for Keir Starmer?
It's really a sideshow compared with those huge issues and matters of life and death and war and economic recession that we're seeing being played out in the Middle East. And we have to remember that the British press is 80% owned by right-wing magnates. And so the press is very biased against Starmer. He doesn't have an easy time. I'm not saying that he's blameless, but there is a movement that wants him out, and that doesn't help. But he has not helped himself. Denis MacShane mentioned a moment ago some of the leaders that Britain has had that really had integrity, that really spoke to the public as if they knew what they believed. And Starmer is an excellent technocrat and lawyer, but he doesn't have that connection with what he really feels. And there are huge issues. There's the issue of Gaza. There's the issue of the Middle East conflict. There's the issue of Brexit, which of course has caused much of the damage to the UK economy that Denis MacShane just described and was the legacy that he inherited. But he hasn't come out and said what he thinks. You know, we know from his time as a lawyer that he is quite radical, that he has strongly held beliefs, but we haven't heard any of those strongly held beliefs. We have just heard him tinkering, trying to do whatever he thinks the right-wing press and the electoral threat that Reform, the right-wing party in the UK, poses. He's been trying to please them rather than stepping back and saying, no, this is what I believe, and this is the country that Britain is. And I think if he'd done that, none of these issues would be able to have the purchase that they have today in the press.
OK, Denis, the opposition, as well as many others, will be sharpening their knives for Keir Starmer ahead of Monday. What political traps does he actually need to avoid when he faces Parliament, and how do you think that is going to play out?
I don't think money will be that important. Everything is out in the open. I haven't got time to discuss the technicalities of this famous vetting process, which in the end, if the Prime Minister wants to appoint you or Giles or anybody to be an ambassador somewhere, he's got that sovereign right, if you like. I mean, Peter Mandelson certainly was a friend of Jeffrey Epstein, but so was Jeffrey Epstein at the heart of the royal family through Prince Andrew, and in a much more serious way, but with sex and young women, not Peter's problem, young women. And who is the very best friend that Jeffrey Epstein ever had on God's good earth? It was Donald Trump. So I mean, I myself would say wait for May the 7th, let the voters give their verdict. And if they look at all the reports, and it's been fairly well covered. I was a very young president of the National Union of Journalists, so I'm with Giles. I defend the right of journalists to behave as they want. But let's see what the voters think in, less than 3 weeks' time now. And if there's a lot of Labour seats lost, Keir Starmer will have no choice but to draw certain conclusions.
Giles, we've only got about a minute left. Is this the political opening that the Conservatives need to try and win back a lot of the support that they've lost, especially to the Reform Party? What can they do to make the most of this political crisis for Starmer?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think they've been doing a good job recently of holding the government to account. Is it going to benefit them? Jury's still out on that. You know, the political system in the UK is becoming more and more fragmented. We used to essentially have a two-party system. Now we have a five-party system where you've got 5 parties which are all polling sort of between 15 to 22% of the vote. So it's a lot more transactional. It's a lot more volatile. As Denis said, I think we need to wait to see what the outcome is of the election on May the 7th. But if Labour do lose a lot of councillors, if they do badly in Scotland or Wales, as I say, I think the writing is on the wall for Starmer, and there will be calls and demand for him to set out a timetable for his departure.
OK, thank you so much. We'll have to leave it there as we are out of time. But Denis, MacShane, Jennifer, Nadel and Giles Kenningham, thank you so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Well, thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Tom McRae, and the whole team here, goodbye for now.